Okay. Do we have a clicker? Well, I guess
Yes,
we need to.
Eric, you got the clicker?
Yes, I do. Perfect. I'm getting it all set up.
Does that have a laser pointer?
It is a laser pointer.
Okay, just checking.
Just don't point
Asking
at
for a
anybody's
friend.
eye.
You wanted to chase it?
Well, maybe not for me.
Yeah, see, like there.
Okay, so our first segment is Introduction to Societies. My name is Susan Lawyer. I'm the Shepherd of Shepherds. At this point in our program, you should know that you're in a society that has a shepherd, right? Everybody raise your hand if you know you're in a society and you know who your shepherd is. That's awesome. Wonderful. Well, we broke into society sort of like in scouting, like we break into patrols, but since we're Methodist, we went ahead and picked Methodist societies. If you've joined us on a course before, you might have noticed that we have different names for our societies this time. In the past, we've done traditional Charles Wesley, Susanna Wesley, John Wesley, but this year we went with Pioneers of American Methodism. So I'm going to let each shepherd introduce themselves and tell why they picked the person that they picked.
Is that it?
That's it. Come on up. Society,
No
shepherd,
dance.
shepherd number one.
Well, if you rode with me yesterday up to the church, you've heard most of the spiel, so you get to hear it again. But if you haven't, you get to hear it for the first time. I'm Cliff Cohen, and I love this part of New Mexico. I'm from Texas. Don't tell the New Mexico people that, because they're not real fond of Texans. But in the process of being associated with it for several years, I looked at a little history. And our guy is right up the road here on the left. He's in the cemetery at Cimarron. Reverend, well, he started life as Benjamin Franklin Toby, and sometime in his childhood they changed it to Franklin James Toby, but they basically went with FJ. To understand what he did, you have to understand a little bit about the history of this area. Originally under Spanish colonization,
You're an English teacher still.
there was a huge land grant given to a couple of guys named Beaubien and Miranda. Well, there was a mountain man, an American, named Lucian Maxwell, who came out to the area, and well, he married into one of the families, the Beaubien family, I believe. And as other parts of the family died off, or let him buy them out, he got the huge land grant. Now Maxwell was kind of a easygoing guy as far as property and land and so forth goes. So he let people live on his millions of acres for, yeah, maybe you even, if you heard it last night at the campfire, you heard about him trading off for land and cattle and things like that. Well, he did that. Or he just let people stay there. It was a handshake agreement, and he was good with it. But at one point, he decided he wanted to sell it all, so he did. Moved down south, that's another story, but moved down south and sold it to a British consortium who also, being big money, got involved with, surprise, corrupt politicians. And they wanted the people living on Maxwell's land to pay up or get off. And they may have been living there for 30 years or something like that. Okay? So there's a lot of unrest going on here. Enter Reverend Toby. He comes in, he's appointed pastor to Cimarron and Elizabethtown, Boomtown up around the Enchanted Circle, which you really need to go to if you get a chance. And he sides with, sort of predictably for a Methodist, with the poor people or the disadvantaged people. He writes letters to newspapers. He preaches against it. Gets on the bad side of the wrong people. Now, everybody liked Toby. He even made friends with one of the gunfighters who lived in Cimarron named Clay Allison, which you wouldn't really think they would, but they became friends. Everybody liked him. But one day, he's scheduled to preach in this church in Elizabethtown, and he goes up to Cimarron Canyon out here. He doesn't come home. He's found dead under a tree. Nothing's been stolen. So they decided it had to be related to this issue that caused him to be killed. Well, they accused one guy and they couldn't get him to confess, so they strung him up off and on, got a confession out of him. He implemented another guy. Clay Allison avenged his friend in a gunfight, and that began the Colfax County War, which lasted for 20 years or so. But if you go up to the cemetery on the way into town, it's on the little hill on the left, you can find this, the gray tombstone. The white one was his original one, which kind of surprisingly turned up in the St. James Hotel at one point or another. But that's Reverend Toby. That's my society. Okay.
Get myself organized here. I'm David Hensley. I'm the shepherd of the John Stewart Society. What led me to choose John Stewart? I was kind of poking around about this when we were talking about the pioneers of early American Methodism. I had been in some discussions on both sides of the issue about the diversity issue within scouting and within the church and within our society and stuff. And I actually somehow serendipitously, this tends to happen to me sometimes, stumbled across John Stewart and his story. John Stewart was born a free man. His mother was African, living in the United States. Who his father was, he was either East Indian or white man. Not real certain that the story somewhat varies there. But nevertheless, he was born a free man in the late 1700s in Virginia. Grew up there. As a young man, his parents had moved to Tennessee, and as a young man he decided that he was going to go back and join his parents. Now on his way to Tennessee, I don't exactly quite figure this out, but he ends up in Ohio. In his journey he is attacked by some highway robbers and loses all of his possessions, and that throws him into a very deep depression. He in fact begins to consider suicide, thinking about killing himself. He takes to drink. He spends his time drinking and wandering around, but during this period of his life he begins to feel that God is calling him in some type of way. And as happenstance would occur, he ends up at a Methodist camp meeting. And at this camp meeting, he begins to, again, he hears this call from God and this call tells him to let the people know who God is. Now, that doesn't exactly cure his drinking and some of the other issues that he has. He continues with that, but he continues to struggle with this call that he hears. And for whatever reason, he decides that he is going to go forward and he is going to be a missionary to the Native Americans. And for whatever reason, he also decides that the people he's going to go and preach to, I did not know how to pronounce the tribe, but I got but to the Wyandotte people who lived in the Sandusky area of Ohio. So as he moves along, supposedly John Stewart had a beautiful voice. And what is it that Methodists love to do? Sing. And so along the way, he sang his way through the Delawares and up to the Wyandotte people and started preaching there. And he started making conversions, people wanting to come to Christianity. Now the problem with that was, though, he did not have a license to preach. And some of the other missionaries who were there, who were not Methodists, let us say that, became jealous of his success. And so they began to accuse him of various kinds of things. For one, that he was a runaway slave. which he was able to prove his freedom. He goes to the annual conference and becomes ordained. And then in 1819, right, it was 1816, he becomes ordained. In 1890, he then continues his missionary work, and he petitions the annual conference to send him some money. He says, I need some help. And the annual conference then began to support his missionary work with, not only with money, which he was then able to use that money to build a small little school. You can sort of see a picture there of it, and a house. And they also sent other missionaries there. But then what happened to this is that in 1819, the Ohio Annual Conference to the Methodist Episcopal Church established the mission there to the Indians. And out of that establishment of that missionary society, then that grew the global now I'm blocking on what we call it today, but the global society for missionary service throughout the world. Unfortunately, John was a sickly man. He suffered from tuberculosis. He died at a very young age, at 32. But he so impacted the people, the Wyandotte people, that in 1843, when they were forced by Congress and Andrew Jackson Native Americans were forced to move westward, the Wyandotte people wanted to know what could we do with his remains to protect his remains. So they dug his remains up and put his remains in their cemetery so that his remains would be protected. Even to this day, if you go to the Wyandotte Nation website and you read about their legacy, they mention John Stewart as an important individual in their history. And so that was the story of the John Stewart Society. I think it's interesting. A man of mixed racial heritage goes to the Native Americans and spreads Christianity to them. The Methodist Church did hold some of that land for a long time. And I think it was in 2018 they deeded the land there in Ohio back over to the Wyandotte Nation. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Now, this one we can ignore, right?
Our society is the Captain Joseph Ogel. Captain Joseph Ogel was a Revolutionary War hero, fought in what is now West Virginia. There's some indication he may have been on the journey with George Rogers Clark to capture what we now know as Illinois, which was then part of the Virginia. Virginia actually ran from Virginia all the way to the Mississippi River.
On South County.
So it ran all the way to the French and Spanish territory, which was across the river in what is now Missouri. So likely he was in that journey, one of the troops, but I wasn't able to verify that. But he does settle in the 1785. He's in Virginia again. He really opposes slavery. And he moves to the area that he knew, there on the frontier, in what is now what would be the St. Louis metro area, about 30 miles due south of St. Louis, which actually St. Louis sits on a little dip on the river, so it's actually in Illinois, in what we now call the American Bottom. He settles in a little town, town being probably 3 to 4 houses, in new design in what is now Monroe County, Illinois. Now, he is, at that point, we're not sure, we're pretty sure he was a Methodist, but not a lot of background. By the time he gets here, he is a Methodist. And there are 2 groups in town, the Methodist and the Baptist. And the 2 actually, there was not a church there, but the Methodist, he starts the first class meetings and society meetings, which is why Methodist had societies. So he starts the first society in Illinois, and actually the farthest west that we have recorded in about 1785, in around that area. Then Methodism kind of slowly spreads out. He wants new territory, and also new design would have been on the Mississippi River floodplain. Not necessarily the nicest place to live, great farmland. There is a disadvantage. It floods almost every year. So he moves to high ground about 25 miles north on the Bellefontaine to Cahokia Road. Bellefontaine was a French fortification. Cahokia was the largest settlement in the west at that time. So he's on that main road on high ground. And a personal tie to that, my ancestors were also on Ridge Prairie.
Ooh.
It's kind of one of those things when I was researching and I'm like, wow, they probably knew each other. So he settles there. Bishop McKendry starts looking for Methodist. He is there. He's already got a society going in that area. And they start doing camp meetings. So he does a camp meeting to the west, to the east of where he was living, about 15 miles, at a point known as Three Springs. So, and that founded the first Methodist church in Illinois, still existing. And you can actually drive by that. That church is still there. They've got a rebuild, it was about 1850. And when they did a renovation about 15, 20 years ago, they kept the original church. So it really is one of the old churches there. And across the street was the Methodist cemetery, now the city cemetery. And there's a monument to Captain Ogel there. But he ends up starting then another church, helping start another church with William McKendry, Bishop McKendry, about 20 miles to the north at what is now Glen Carbon. So he was really the first Methodist in Illinois, first Methodist really to be in that area of the Mississippi River. And so he is the beginning of Methodism in Illinois.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name's John Anderson. I'm from Anchorage, Alaska, and I am involved with the Harry Denman Society. Now, Harry Denman, very interesting person. He was born in 1893 and passed away in 1976. He was a distinguished Methodist lay evangelist who traveled the world preaching the gospel. He became the General Secretary of the Commission on Evangelism in 1939 and went on from there to actually be one of the founders of the Foundation for Evangelism in 1949. This is one of the things that I find so intriguing about the guy. He was mentioned by none other than one of the best-known evangelists of the last century, Billy Graham. He wrote that Denman was his mentor in evangelism, Billy Graham. Mr. Denman really had no interest in material possessions. He was raised without very much money in the family. And he lived to preach, to bring people to Christ. Consequently, he traveled the world with one suit, one tie, a change of shirt, change of underwear, change of socks. He traveled the world, and that's all he had to his name. Anytime he was given a gift, the gift was donated to some agency. Truly sacrificing individual. He was a driven man. This statistic I find astounding. In one 48-hour period, he preached in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Indiana. 48 hours. Thousands of people heard him preach. And I think that he would probably be my definition of a servant leader. We talk about servant leaders, we all want to be servant leaders. Well, you could model yourself after this guy. Now, there's also a prestigious award called the Harry Denman Evangelism Award. It was established in his honor. One layperson and one clergy per annual conference can be nominated per year for this honor. And this is a biography that I found quite intriguing, that if his brief description of what he's done and his life intrigues you, look this up. It's a really good read. Thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, I'm Ross Johnson, and I'm the shepherd over the Captain Thomas Webb Society. And a couple things I liked about the Thomas Webb, particularly Captain Thomas Webb, was his military background. I spent a number of years in the Marines, and I'm now a member of Christ Church United Methodist, and I'm considered just a little bit more dynamic in how I approach some of the things than sometimes I should be. That made me feel good when I started reading the autobiography of Thomas Webb. Can you picture this gentleman? Gentleman has got a patch over his eye, right eye, which he lost during the Battle of Lewisburg in the United States. Well, in the United States that time, at that time it was just the colonies. He lost his right eye to a musket round went through it. They didn't think he was going to live, but he kept saying, he says, the Lord hasn't got me yet. So I think the other thing that got it is that our church during the pandemic had talked about, because we did not hold service for a long time. And he reminded us, our pastor reminded us, that in reality, folks, you are the church. The church is not this building, you know, that we developed the church. The churches were not put together by Jesus, you know. We go out and we reach out and we become our own ministers. So that's another one of the things I think that really struck me with him. Captain Webb was born in 1724, died in 1796, lived to be a nice age of 72. He also, according to Wesley, was the first apostle of the American Methodism in the colonies. And why was that? First, Thomas Webb was awakened by preaching by John Wesley in 1764. He was not a Christian. He was just a military officer and had been stationed in the colonies a number of times. And when he went to a service by Wesley, he was struck, you know, by what Wesley had to say, and then he was sent to the colonies. While he was in the colonies, he actually attended a service, and the preacher who was at the service could not show up, or did not show up. And so Wesley showed up, and for the first time, and became a touchstone of his, was he approached the pulpit with a sword in his hand. He dropped the sword on the pulpit. He had this, you can picture this gentleman, a patch over his eye. He had a red jacket with a little bit of gold on it, and he had this sword. And he began to preach. And he preached, and it just made folks within the congregation at that time really feel the love of Jesus. He wound up joining the Methodist Society in 1765. He was known then from that point on as the preacher with the sword and the Bible. He always challenged folks about what their beliefs were. He never challenged anybody, nor did I ever read in his autobiography that he ever used the sword to force anybody anywhere. But he always advanced to the altar in his regimental uniform and considered himself the soldier of Jesus Christ. And he was very adamant about it. He was a founder of the first Wesley Chapel. He also spread Methodism and the denomination to Long Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York. As an impact preacher, he was most prominent in many of the events in the colonies of the birth and the growth of the Methodist Church. It was invigorating, and his blessings from God came to America with the arrival of Captain Thomas Webb. John Adams stated, John Adams said, "I attended a service by Captain Thomas Webb, and this is what he said. He says, the captain is one of the most fluent and elegant men I have ever heard. He reaches the imagination and touches the passions extremely well and expresses himself with great propriety. He has you feeling that God is in the room and that God is also in you." And as such, Thomas Webb returned to England after serving in the colonies and passed away at the age of 72 in 1796. I appreciate it, and I thank you all very much for learning a little bit more about Captain Thomas Webb.
All right. And then the last society is the Barbara Heck Society. Again, my name is Susan Lawyer. And Barbara Heck is a great one to follow Captain Thomas Webb because their stories are entwined. Barbara Heck is known as the mother of American Methodism. And really the story of Barbara Heck is the story of the John Street Church in New York. So in 1760, a number of Irish Methodists immigrated to New York City, and that included the Embrys and the Hecks. And they began meeting in the home of the Embrys, and they started a Methodist society. And as more people joined, they had to move out of the home and find some space to rent in New York. So they rented some space called the Old Rigging Loft, and they began meeting there. And they soon outgrew that space, and so they ended up moving to a site down the street on John Street. And that first building erected on this site was known as the Wesley Chapel. And that is the same Wesley Chapel that our Captain Thomas Webb spoke at. So Philip Embry was soon joined on the pulpit by Captain Thomas Webb, which you heard how he brought the people in. And the Wesley Chapel is the first permanent home of America's oldest continuous congregation. So when you think of Barbara Heck, you'll think of the John Street Church, you'll think of Thomas Webb. And I chose a female to be our society leader. We had done Susanna Wesley in the past, and I thought Barbara Heck was sort of an interesting person to go with. So that's what I have for that. Now, we are going to take a few minutes to get to know each other now that you've gotten to know a little bit about the namesake of your society. And we're going to move into a time where we're going to do some icebreakers so we get to know everybody. Why are you shaking your head now? Yeah. We're going to all meet each other from now on, now that you've met your shepherds. So that is what I have for Intro to Societies. And did we want to go ahead and move outside to do that, or do you want to give directions inside?
So let me give you some directions inside.
Yes, sir.
So first off, in the finest tradition of United Methodist Scouting, I have.
Oh, chicken flicken!
But this is my attention chicken.